You are lying somewhere soft right now. Maybe your head is on a pillow. Maybe you have pulled the blanket up to your chin. Maybe the room is dark, or maybe there is a single light still glowing somewhere behind you. Whatever your situation is right now, I want you to know something. The fact that you are comfortable enough to lie down, warm enough to relax, safe enough to close your eyes, that is extraordinary. Not because comfort is rare in our modern world. It is everywhere. But because for most of human history, the kind of safety you feel right now was something people had to build from scratch every single day. And no one built it harder or with less recognition than the ordinary people of medieval Europe. Not the kings, not the knights, not the bishops in their golden robes. The ordinary people. The ones who woke up before the sun and worked until their hands cracked. The ones who fed entire civilizations and never once saw their names written down anywhere. The ones whose daily routines were so repetitive, so physically demanding, so utterly consumed by the simple act of staying alive, that you would think their lives were boring. They were not boring. They were astonishing. And tonight, I'm going to walk you through every single hour of their day. From the moment the rooster screamed them out of sleep, to the moment they collapsed back onto a straw mattress that smelled like smoke and sweat and old wool. We are going to walk through it slowly, carefully, in so much detail that by the end you will understand something that most history books never bother to tell you. That the medieval world was not a backdrop for kings and battles. It was a living, breathing, exhausting, sometimes beautiful world built entirely on the backs of people whose names we will never know. And the way they lived their ordinary days contains secrets about human nature, about work, about community, about sleep itself, that are more relevant to your life right now than you might expect. But before we begin, I need to tell you something that is going to reframe everything you think you know about the Middle Ages, something that changes the entire picture. And it starts with a sound. Imagine darkness, total darkness. Not the kind of darkness you experience when you turn off your bedroom light and can still see the faint glow of a street lamp through the curtain, or the tiny green dot of a smoke detector on the ceiling, or the pale rectangle of your phone screen face down on the nightstand. Not that kind of darkness. Real darkness. The kind of darkness where you hold your hand 6 inches from your face and cannot see it. The kind of darkness that is so complete, so total, so absolute, that your brain starts inventing things to see. Shapes that are not there. Movements in the corner of your eye. Your visual cortex firing randomly because it has nothing real to process, and it cannot accept the void. That is the darkness that a medieval peasant woke up to every single morning between October and March. No electricity, no gas lamps, no candles burning through the night because candles cost money, and money was something most medieval people never had enough of. Just darkness. Thick, heavy, living darkness that pressed against your eyes like a physical weight, and then, cutting through that darkness, a sound. Not an alarm clock, not a phone notification, a rooster. Somewhere outside the walls of your house, which were probably made of wattle and daub, which is a fancy way of saying sticks woven together and smeared with a mixture of mud, straw and animal dung, somewhere outside those thin, imperfect walls, a rooster opened its beak and screamed at the sky. That sound was the medieval alarm clock. Unreliable, unpredictable, occasionally eaten by a fox, but it was what you had. And when you heard it, your body knew what to do even before your mind caught up, because your body had done this 10,000 times before. Your body knew the routine the way your lungs know how to breathe. You opened your eyes. You saw nothing. You felt the straw beneath you, the rough wool blanket over you, the warm bodies of your family pressed against you on every side. Because medieval people did not sleep alone. They could not afford to sleep alone. Heat was too precious to waste. A peasant family of 5 or 6 or 7 people slept together on a single straw mattress, sometimes on the floor, sometimes on a raised wooden platform if the family was slightly better off. The children were tucked between the adults. The baby was wherever the mother was, usually still latched to a breast because nighttime nursing was not a choice, it was survival. And here is something that nobody tells you about medieval sleep. something that would have been completely obvious to anyone living before the 17th century, but that seems bizarre and almost unbelievable to us. They did not sleep the way you sleep. They did not lie down at 9 or 10 at night and sleep straight through until morning. That pattern, what scientists call monophasic sleep, one single unbroken block of sleep per night, is actually a modern invention. It is a product of artificial lighting. Before electric lights and even before cheap candles, people practiced what historians now call biphasic sleep or segmented sleep. Here is how it worked. You went to sleep shortly after sunset because there was literally nothing else to do in the dark. You slept for 3 or 4 hours. Then you woke up. Naturally, without an alarm. Your body just surfaced from the deep water of sleep and floated for a while. In this middle of the night wakefulness, this gap between what people called first sleep and second sleep, was not insomnia. It was not a problem. It was normal. It was expected. It was even useful. During that wakeful period, which could last an hour or two, people did things. Quiet things. They prayed. They talked softly with whoever was lying next to them. They checked on the fire. They checked on the animals. They thought about things. They made love. Some historians believe that the quiet intimacy of this wakeful period between first sleep and second sleep was actually when most medieval conception happened. It was the only time a married couple had any privacy, any darkness, any stillness away from the constant demands of daylight. And then, after an hour or two of this gentle wakefulness, they slipped back into second sleep. Deeper this time, dreamier. The kind of sleep where the mind loosens its grip on reality and lets images flow through without resistance. Second sleep lasted until the rooster or the dawn or both. Think about that for a moment. For thousands of years humans had 2 sleeps per night with a quiet wakeful period in between. We have references to first sleep and second sleep in literature, legal documents, medical texts, and personal letters from the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, and even into the early modern period. It was so normal that nobody thought to explain it. It would be like explaining breathing. Everybody knew. And then artificial lighting arrived. Gas lamps, then electric lights. Suddenly the night was not dark anymore. People stayed up later. The gap between first sleep and second sleep collapsed. By the 20th century, segmented sleep had been forgotten so completely that when the historian Roger Ekert rediscovered it in old documents, the scientific community was shocked. We had erased an entire pattern of human sleep from our collective memory. So if you sometimes wake up in the middle of the night and lie there for an hour feeling like something is wrong with you, consider this. Maybe nothing is wrong with you. Maybe your body is remembering an ancient pattern that was perfectly normal for hundreds of generations. Maybe that middle of the night wakefulness is not insomnia. Maybe it is first sleep ending and your body waiting patiently for second sleep to begin. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let us go back to that dark medieval morning. The rooster has crowed. Your eyes are open but seeing nothing. Your body is warm from the press of family, but your face is cold because the fire burned down hours ago, and now comes the first real task of the medieval day. The task that every single person in every single household performed before anything else. Before eating. Before dressing. Before feeding the animals or checking the crops or walking to the well for water. The fire. You need to understand something about fire in the medieval world that is easy to overlook, because fire is so easy for us. You flick a switch, you turn a dial, you press a button on your stove and a blue flame appears instantly, reliably, perfectly. Fire is something you barely think about. For a medieval peasant, fire was the single most important technology in their daily life, more important than any tool, more important than any piece of clothing, more important than the house itself, because without fire you could not cook, and without cooking you could not eat most of the food available to you. Raw grain is nearly indigestible. Raw beans will make you violently ill. Raw meat spoils within hours in warm weather. The entire medieval diet, almost everything a peasant ate, required fire to transform it from raw ingredients into something the human body could actually use. And fire in the medieval world was not easy. There were no matches. Matches would not be invented until the 19th century. If your fire went out completely overnight, which happened, especially in bitter cold when the fire consumed fuel faster than you had banked it. You had a serious problem. You could restart it using a flint and steel, striking sparks onto a piece of char cloth or dried tinder fungus. But this was difficult. It required good materials, dry conditions, patience, and skill. On a cold, wet morning with numb fingers and a hungry family waiting, coaxing a spark into a flame could take 20 minutes or more, and 20 minutes of cold, dark fumbling when you were already exhausted from yesterday's labor feels like an eternity. This is why the last thing anyone did before going to sleep at night was bank the fire. Banking means carefully arranging the coals and covering them with a thick layer of ash. The ash insulates the coals, slows their burning, keeps them alive through the night without consuming too much fuel. Done properly, you could uncover those coals in the morning, blow on them gently, add some dry kindling, and have a working fire again within minutes. Done badly, you woke up to a cold, dead hearth and a very difficult start to your day. The person who tended the fire varied by household, but it was often the wife or the eldest daughter. She would kneel by the hearth in the darkness, feeling for the warm spot in the ashes, gently scraping away the insulating layer with her bare hands, finding the glowing coals underneath, leaning close enough to blow on them without getting ash in her eyes. The first breath might produce nothing visible. The second breath might coax a faint orange glow. The third breath, aimed just right, low and steady, might bring a coal back to full brightness. Then she would place a piece of dried grass or a thin stick on the coal, shelter it with her cupped hands, blow again, and suddenly, there it was. Fire. The first fire of the day. The hearth coming back to life like a heart restarting. Within minutes, the fire was giving off heat and light, and the light was almost as important as the heat, because now, for the first time since sunset the previous evening, people could see. The single room of the peasant house, because most peasant houses were a single room, emerged from the darkness. The walls, the tools hanging from pegs, the table, if they had one, the children blinking and stretching on the mattress, the animals in the other half of the house, because yes, many medieval peasant families shared their house with their livestock. Cows, pigs, chickens, sometimes a goat. The animals were kept inside not because medieval people enjoyed the smell, which was considerable, but because the animals generated body heat that helped warm the house, and because keeping them inside protected them from theft and predators. And now I want you to think about something that reveals just how different medieval daily life was from ours. That fire the woman just restarted. That small hearth fire in the center or against one wall of a single-room house. That was the only source of heat, light, and cooking power for the entire family. There was no backup, no second system, no thermostat to adjust. If it rained and the fuel was wet, the fire smoked terribly, and the whole house filled with acrid haze that made your eyes burn and your lungs ache. If the wind shifted and blew down the chimney, assuming you even had a chimney because many early medieval houses did not, the smoke just poured back into the room. If you ran out of firewood, you were cold and hungry, and there was nothing you could do about it except go find more wood, which in many parts of medieval Europe was not as simple as it sounds. Because here is a detail that most people do not realize about the medieval landscape. The forests did not belong to you. In much of England and continental Europe, the forests belonged to the lord or the king. Cutting wood from those forests without permission was a crime, sometimes a serious crime. There were entire legal systems built around forest rights. Who could cut what, where, when, and how much? Peasants were often restricted to collecting deadfall, branches that had already fallen from trees, rather than cutting living wood. This meant that fuel was not just labor-intensive to gather, it was legally constrained. You could spend your entire morning dragging fallen branches back to your house and still not have enough to keep the fire burning through the next night. This single fact, the difficulty of simply keeping a fire going, shaped medieval life in ways that ripple outward into everything. It determined what people ate, because you could not waste fuel on complicated cooking. It determined when people woke up and went to sleep, because artificial light required fuel you might not have. It determined the architecture of houses, because every design decision was partly about heat retention. It determined social relationships because sharing fire and fuel was a community activity, not an individual one. But the fire is burning now. The house is warming slowly, and the day's first wheel work is about to begin. The woman who restarted the fire is already moving. She has a pot, probably made of clay, possibly iron if the family has some wealth, and she is preparing the morning meal. But before we talk about what medieval people ate for breakfast, I need to tell you about water, because water is where the medieval morning gets interesting in ways you would never expect. You turn on a tap. Water comes out. Clean, treated, pressurized, delivered through pipes to your kitchen, your bathroom, your garden hose. You do not think about where it comes from. You do not worry about whether it will make you sick. We do not wonder if it will be there tomorrow. A medieval peasant thought about water constantly. Water was labor. Water was neighbor. Water was neighbor. Water was danger. The nearest water source might be a well in the village center, a stream at the bottom of a hill, or a spring half a mile away. Someone had to walk to that water source, fill a container, and carry it back. Every single day, usually multiple times a day. The container might be a wooden bucket, a clay jug, or a leather bag. It was heavy. Wash weighs about 8 pounds per gallon, and a family needed several gallons per day for drinking, cooking, cleaning, and animal care. This means someone, and that someone was almost always a woman or an older child, was carrying 30 or 40 pounds of water up a hill or across a field multiple times every morning before the day had properly started. And the water itself was not necessarily safe. Medieval people did not understand germ theory. They did not know that water could carry invisible organisms that cause disease. But they were not stupid. They knew from centuries of experience that some water sources made people sick and others did not. They avoided stagnant water. They preferred flowing streams and deep wells. They noticed that water downstream from a tannery or a slaughterhouse tasted bad and caused stomach problems. They made practical decisions based on observation, even without the scientific framework to explain why those decisions work. But despite these precautions, waterborne illness was a constant presence in medieval life. Dysentery, cholera, typhoid, parasitic infections. These were not rare events. They were background noise. A medieval peasant probably experienced some form of gastrointestinal illness multiple times per year. Children were especially vulnerable. The death rate for children under 5 in medieval Europe was staggering. Estimates vary, but somewhere between 30 and 50% of children died before their 5th birthday. That number is so large that it is almost impossible to comprehend in modern terms. Think about what that means for the people carrying that water every morning. Every woman who filled a bucket at the well knew women whose children had died. She might have lost children herself. 1 in 3, 1 in 2. These were not statistics to her. They were her baby who stopped breathing one night, her toddler who developed a fever and was gone within 3 days, her neighbour's son who drank from the wrong stream and never recovered. And yet she carried the water every morning. Because the living still needed to drink, and the pottage still needed to cook, and the day was not going to wait for grief. I am going to come back to water later because it connects to something much larger about medieval life. But right now, the fire is burning, the water has been fetched, and the morning meal is being prepared. And this is where we encounter one of the most misunderstood aspects of medieval daily life, the food. If you have ever seen a medieval feast depicted in a movie, you have seen long tables groaning with roasted meats, whole roasted pigs with apples in their mouths, wheels of cheese, mountains of bread, goblets overflowing with wine. And those feasts did happen. The lords and ladies and wealthy merchants and high-ranking clergy. But that was not what most people ate. What most people ate, every single day, for most of their lives, was pottage. Pottage. Say the word and it sounds almost comical, like something from a fairy tale. But pottage was the foundation of the medieval diet, and understanding it tells you more about ordinary medieval life than any castle or cathedral ever could. Pottage was, at its simplest, a thick soup or stew made from whatever was available. The base was almost always grain. Barley, oats, sometimes wheat if you were lucky, or rye if you were not. The grain was either added whole, which made a porridge-like consistency, or ground into a rough flour and stirred in as a thickener. To this base you added whatever vegetables you had. Onions, leeks, cabbages, turnips, peas, beans, whatever was in season from the garden behind your house or from the common fields. If you had herbs, you added those. Parsley, thyme, sage. If you had salt, which was expensive, you used it sparingly. If you had a bit of salted pork or a bone with some meat still on it, that went in too. And then you cooked it, slowly, over that precious fire, for hours sometimes, until everything had broken down into a thick, warm, filling mass that tasted, well, it tasted like survival. And here is the thing about pottage that reveals something profound about medieval life. The pot almost never left the fire. You made pottage in the morning. You ate some of it. You left the pot on the fire. Throughout the day, as people came and went, they added things to the pot. More water when it got too thick. More vegetables when someone came back from the garden. A handful of grain. A few more beans. By evening, the pottage was different from what it had been in the morning. By the next morning, it was different again. Some households kept the same pot of pottage going for days or even weeks, constantly adding and eating, adding and eating. The flavor changed, the consistency changed, but the basic concept remained the same. A perpetual pot of food, always warm, always available, always ready. This is not fine dining. This is not cuisine. This is engineering. It is a brilliant, practical solution to a set of impossible constraints. You have limited fuel. You have limited ingredients. You have limited time. You have a family that needs to eat multiple times a day. You have no refrigeration, no preservation technology beyond salting and drying, no way to keep raw food from spoiling. So you put everything in a pot, keep the pot on the fire, and let thermodynamics do the rest. The constant heat kills bacteria. The slow cooking extracts every possible calorie from every ingredient. The perpetual cycle means there is always something warm and ready to eat, no matter what time someone comes home hungry from the fields. If you ever find yourself complaining about eating leftovers, remember that medieval peasants ate leftovers that were 3 weeks old and considered themselves fortunate, because the alternative was not eating at all. Now there is something else about medieval food that I need to tell you, and it connects to a much larger story about the medieval body and the medieval experience of being alive. Medieval people were almost always at least a little bit hungry, not starving, not necessarily, though famine was a real and recurring threat. But that low-level background hunger that comes from never quite having enough calories to fully satisfy your body's needs, that was constant. The average medieval peasant consumed somewhere between 2,000 and 2,500 calories per day, which sounds adequate by modern standards until you remember what they were doing with those calories. They were performing hard physical labor for 10 to 12 hours a day, plowing fields behind an ox, swinging a scythe through waist-high grain, carrying water, carrying wood, carrying children, walking miles to reach their fields, because medieval villages used an open field system where your individual strips of farmland might be scattered across the landscape. Their caloric expenditure was enormous, probably comparable to a modern construction worker or a professional athlete, and they were fueling that expenditure with pottage, with bread, with the occasional piece of cheese or handful of nuts or strip of dried meat. It was enough to survive. It was rarely enough to feel fully satisfied. This chronic low-grade hunger affected everything. It affected mood. It affected energy levels. It affected decision-making. It affected the way people related to food, which was with an intensity and a reverence that we, surrounded by supermarkets and delivery apps, can barely imagine. Food was not taken for granted. Every bite was earned. Every meal was the product of someone's labor, someone's exhaustion, someone's raw and blistered hands. And if you are listening to this and starting to feel drowsy, that is exactly what is supposed to happen. This story is designed to carry you gently downward, like a leaf falling through still water. We do not need to remember any of these details. You do not need to keep track of the timeline. Just let the words wash over you. Let the images form and dissolve. The medieval morning is unfolding at its own pace, and you can follow it as far as you like before sleep carries you the rest of the way. Because the morning is not over. The pottage is bubbling on the fire. The children are stirring. The animals need attention. And the real work of the day has not even started yet. The work that defined medieval life more than anything else. The work that shaped bodies and broke them. The work that fed kingdoms and built cathedrals and sustained a civilization for 1,000 years. The fields are waiting. And what happened in those fields is a story that will change the way you think about every piece of bread you have ever eaten. But before anyone goes to the fields, there is the matter of the animals. And the animals cannot wait. An animal does not care that you are tired. An animal does not care that your back hurts from yesterday's plowing, or that your hands are still raw from threshing grain. An animal is hungry, and an animal is loud, and an animal will make your life miserable if you do not attend to it immediately. The chickens come first because the chickens are the easiest, and because the chickens give you something in return right away. Eggs. We step outside your house into the grey morning light, and the chickens are already up, scratching and pecking at the ground near the door. Medieval chickens were not like modern chickens. They were smaller, scrappier, less productive. A modern commercial hen lays close to 300 eggs per year. A medieval chicken might lay 80 or 100 if you were lucky, and if the chicken survived long enough to reach its laying prime. Foxes, hawks, disease, cold winters, all of these kept the chicken population in constant flux. Every egg was valuable. Every egg that appeared in the nest was a small victory. You scatter some grain for the chickens. Not much. Grain is for people first, animals second. The chickens also feed themselves, pecking at insects and worms and whatever they find on the ground. Medieval chickens were true free-range, not because their owners were making an ethical choice, but because you could not afford to feed them entirely from your own grain supply. They earned their keep by foraging and by producing eggs and occasionally by becoming dinner themselves, though killing a chicken was a calculation. A dead chicken gives you one meal. A living chicken gives you eggs for years. Then the pig. If you have a pig, and many medieval peasant families did, the pig is both your greatest asset and your greatest headache. Pigs are intelligent, resourceful, stubborn, and perpetually hungry. They eat anything. Scraps from the kitchen, acorns from the forest floor, roots they dig up themselves. Other animals' food if given the opportunity. They are medieval garbage disposals, converting waste into meat with remarkable efficiency. A pig raised through the summer and autumn on kitchen scraps, forest foraging, and leftover grain could be slaughtered in November and provide enough preserved pork to last a family through the winter. Salted, smoked, hung in the rafters of the house where the smoke from the hearth would continue to cure it slowly over weeks and months. But a pig also requires management. It needs water. It needs a pen or a tether or someone watching it, because a loose pig will destroy a garden in minutes and will wander off given any opportunity. Pig keeping was often the job of children, specifically the older children who were big enough to be useful, but not yet strong enough for field work. A child of 8 or 9 might spend hours every day following the family pig as it rooted through the village waste areas or foraged in the woods. It was boring, repetitive, sometimes dangerous work. Pigs are powerful animals with strong jaws and a bite that can break bone. A child had to be alert enough to keep the pig out of trouble, but patient enough to tolerate the monotony of watching an animal eat dirt for half the day. The cow, if you had a cow, was an entirely different matter. A cow was wealth. A cow was status. A cow was the medieval equivalent of owning a car and a savings account at the same time. Cows provided milk, which could be drunk fresh, turned into butter, or made into cheese. They provided labor, pulling plows and carts. They provided calves, which could be raised and sold or kept to expand the herd. And at the end of their useful life, they provided meat, hide, horn, and bone. Every part of a cow had a purpose. Nothing was wasted because nothing could be afforded to be wasted, but cows also required enormous amounts of care. They needed to be milked every morning, a task that took skill and patience. A medieval cow was not a modern dairy cow. She was smaller, less docile, and produced far less milk, maybe a gallon or two per day compared to the 6 to 8 gallons a modern Holstein produces. Milking her required getting close to a large animal in an enclosed space, sitting on a low stool, and rhythmically squeezing her teats while she ate from a manger or swished her tail in your face. If she was in a bad mood, she might kick over the bucket. If she was sick, the milk might be off. If she had recently calved, she might be protective and aggressive. Milking was one of those tasks that looked simple to an outsider, but required genuine skill and experience to do well. The milk then had to be processed immediately. There was no refrigeration. Raw milk in a medieval climate would begin to sour within hours in warm weather, so it was either drunk right away, heated for cooking, or started on the path toward butter or cheese. Butter making required churning, a repetitive physical task that could take an hour or more. Cheese making was a multi-day process involving heating the milk, adding rennet extracted from the stomach lining of a calf, draining the curds, pressing them, salting them, and then aging the cheese for weeks or months in a cool spot. Every step required knowledge and timing, and mistakes meant wasted milk, which meant wasted labor, which meant a family with less food for the winter. All of this animal care happened before the main work of the day, before anyone went to the fields, before the sun was fully up, and it happened every day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Animals do not observe weekends. Animals do not keep holidays. The rooster does not care that today is the feast day of St. Michael. The cow's udder does not care that you are up all night with a sick child. The pig does not care about anything except its next meal. And so the medieval morning was a relentless sequence of obligations that had to be fulfilled before you could even begin to think about the work that actually defined your economic existence. The fields. And now we get to the heart of medieval life. The thing that consumed more hours, more energy, more physical suffering, more sweat and blood and broken bones than any other single activity. Farming. But not farming as you might imagine it. Not farming with tractors and combined harvesters and GPS-guided seed drills. Farming with your body. Farming with an ox if you were lucky, and with your own back if you were not. Farming in a way that is so physically brutal, so relentlessly demanding, that if you described it to a modern person as a fitness routine, they would assume you were joking. Let me describe plowing. Not the romantic idea of plowing that you might have from paintings or movies, a farmer walking peacefully behind a horse through golden fields. Real plowing. Medieval plowing. You are standing behind a wooden plow. It is heavy, perhaps 80 to 100 pounds, made almost entirely of wood, with an iron tip called a coulter or plowshare that is the most expensive part of the entire implement. In front of you is an ox, maybe 2 oxen if you could afford them, or if you are sharing with a neighbour. The ox is attached to the plow by a wooden yoke across its shoulders. Your job is to hold the plow steady, keep it at the right depth, guide it in a straight line, and control the ox, all at the same time. The ox begins to walk. The plow bites into the earth. Immediately you feel the resistance. Medieval soil was not the light, well-amended, fertilized soil of a modern farm. It was heavy clay in many parts of Europe, dense and sticky when wet, hard and cracked when dry. The plow had to cut through this soil, turn it over, expose the lower layers to air and sunlight. And every step of the way, the plow was fighting you, hitting rocks that jarred your arms and shoulders, catching on roots that brought the ox to a sudden stop, sliding sideways on slopes, getting stuck in wet patches that turned the ground into a sucking mud that grabbed the plow and would not let go. You walked behind that plow and would not let go. You walked behind that plow for hours, miles. A single acre of land might require walking 11 miles behind the plow to turn over every furrow. And a peasant family might be responsible for 15 or 20 or 30 acres of land. Not all of it needed to be ploughed at once. The medieval crop rotation system meant that some fields were fallow in any given year, but the total amount of ploughing a single family had to accomplish over the course of a season was staggering. And ploughing was just the beginning. After ploughing came harrowing, dragging a heavy wooden frame studded with wooden or iron teeth across the ploughed ground to break up the clods and create a smoother surface for planting. Then came sowing, walking the length of each furrow, scattering seed by hand from a bag slung over your shoulder. This required a steady rhythm and a practiced eye. Too much seed in one spot and the plants would crowd each other. Too little and you would have gaps in your crop. The skill was in the wrist, a particular flicking motion that sent the grain arcing through the air in an even spread. Children followed behind, raking the soil lightly to cover the seed and protect it from birds. Then you waited. And while you waited, you did everything else. Weeded the garden, mended fences, repaired tools, cut hay for the animals, gathered firewood, fetched water, washed clothes, which was done in the nearest stream by pounding them against rocks, a process that destroyed fabric and skin alike, but was the only option available. Spun wool into thread, which was done almost constantly by women using a drop spindle, a simple weighted stick that they could spin while walking, talking, supervising children, or doing almost anything else. Spinning was so omnipresent in medieval women's lives that the word spinster, which originally just meant a woman who spins, became the legal term for an unmarried woman because every unmarried woman spent most of her time spinning. Then harvest came, and harvest was the crescendo of the medieval agricultural year, the moment when everything you had worked for since spring either paid off or collapsed. A good harvest meant survival through the winter. A bad harvest meant hunger. A catastrophic harvest meant famine, and medieval famine was not a metaphor. It was skeletal children with distended bellies. It was adults eating bark and grass and boiled leather. It was entire villages dying. Famine was the monster that lived in the shadow of every medieval harvest, and the knowledge of its proximity gave the harvest an urgency and an emotional intensity that is difficult to overstate. Harvesting grain was done with a sickle, a curved blade on a short handle, or with a scythe, a longer blade on a long handle that allowed you to cut standing grain in sweeping arcs. Either way, it was back-breaking work performed in the hottest days of late summer. You bent over for hours, grabbing handfuls of grain stalks and cutting them close to the ground, gathering them into bundles called sheaves, stacking the sheaves into stooks to dry in the field. The stubble left behind was sharp and cut your ankles. The grain dust filled your lungs and your eyes. Insects swarmed around the disturbed stalks. The sun beat down on your bent back without mercy. Everyone worked during harvest. Men, women, children, the elderly, anyone who could hold a sickle or carry a sheaf. Normal social rules relaxed. Gender roles blurred. The old woman who could barely walk still sat at the edge of the field binding sheaves. The child too young to cut grain ran back and forth carrying water for the workers. The Lord's own servants might be drafted to help if the harvest was large enough. It was a collective effort of the entire community, driven by the knowledge that failure here meant death later. After cutting came threshing, which was the process of separating the grain kernels from the stalks. This was done by beating the sheaves with a wooden flail on a hard floor, swinging the flail over your head and bringing it down again and again in a rhythm that used every muscle in your arms, shoulders, back, and core. Threshing was so physically demanding that it was primarily a winter activity because it generated enough body heat to keep you warm in an unheated barn. Medieval people essentially used grain processing as their winter heating system. After threshing came winnowing, tossing the grain into the air and letting the wind blow away the lighter chaff while the heavier grain kernels fell back down. And the grain had to be stored, which meant keeping it dry, keeping it away from rats and mice and weevils and mold, in a structure that might not be waterproof or vermin-proof because medieval construction was what it was. A significant portion of every harvest was lost to spoilage and pests before it could be eaten. And all of this, every step of this process, from ploughing to storage, was performed without any source of power except human muscle and animal muscle. No engines, no motors, no electricity, no fossil fuels. Just bodies doing work, day after day, season after season, year after year, for an entire lifetime. This is what ordinary medieval people did. This is how bread got made. This is the labour that fed Europe. And it is so foreign to our experience, so far removed from our daily reality of buying bread in plastic bags from climate-controlled supermarkets, that it is almost impossible to truly feel the weight of it. But I want you to try, just for a moment. Feel the weight of that wooden plow in your hands. Feel the ox pulling forward and the soil resisting. Feel the sun on the back of your neck, and the sweat running down your spine, and the ache in your shoulders that starts at dawn and does not stop until dark. Feel the dust in your throat, and the blisters on your palms, and the bone-deep tiredness that no amount of sleep ever fully erases. That was a Tuesday. That was an ordinary day in the life of a medieval peasant, and tomorrow would be exactly the same. But the day is not over yet. The sun is beginning to drop toward the horizon. The fields are releasing the heat they absorb during the day, and the village is coming back to life in a different way, because the medieval evening was its own world, with its own rhythms, its own rituals, its own strange and beautiful and sometimes frightening realities. And what happened after dark is going to surprise you, because the medieval night was not empty, it was full of sounds and stories and fears and prayers and quiet conversations between people who had worked themselves to exhaustion and yet still found the energy to be human before sleep took them. The walk home from the fields was itself a ritual, not a quick commute, not a drive in a car with the radio on, a walk through the landscape you had known since birth, past the oak tree where you played as a child, past the stream where you fetched water every morning, past the church, always the church, the tallest building in the village, its stone walls catching the last of the daylight. Medieval villages were small, 50 households, 100 households, rarely more than a few hundred people. You knew every face. You knew who was married to whom and who wished they were married to someone else. You knew who drank too much at the alehouse and who could be trusted to watch your children, and who had a reputation for letting their pigs loose in other people's gardens. The walk home was social. People fell into step with each other. Conversations happened naturally. How was your harvest coming? Did you hear about the miller's daughter? Is it true that the Lord's steward is demanding extra labor service next week? These conversations were the medieval internet. They were how information spread, how rumors traveled, how reputations were built and destroyed, how community standards were enforced without any formal police force or legal system at the village level. And now I want to tell you about something that most people have never heard of. And it reveals something fundamental about medieval community life. The alewife. In many medieval English villages, one or several women brewed ale and sold it from their homes. This was not a pub. This was not a bar. This was a woman's house where she had brewed a batch of ale using barley, water, and whatever bittering agents were available before hops became widely used. She would put a sign outside her door, sometimes literally a branch or a broom handle, to indicate that the ale was ready and people would come to her house to drink. This was the medieval social gathering point, the place where people came after work to sit, to drink, to talk, to argue, to gossip, to flirt, to grieve, to celebrate. The alewife was part bartender, part therapist, part news broadcaster, and the ale itself was not what you imagine when you think of beer. It was thick, cloudy, slightly sweet, low in alcohol, and it spoiled within days. You drank it quickly because you had to. Fresh batches were brewed constantly, and people drank a lot of it, not primarily to get drunk, though that certainly happened, but because ale was safer than water. The brewing process, which involved boiling, killed many of the pathogens that made raw water dangerous. People did not understand why ale was safer than water, but they knew that it was, and so ale became the default beverage of medieval England. Men, women, and children all drank it. At meals, between meals, first thing in the morning, last thing at night. A medieval peasant might consume a gallon or more of weak ale every day. But the evening was not only about drinking, it was about the domestic work that could only be done after the field work was finished. And much of that domestic work fell on women. The evening was when the pottage was refreshed for the next day, when wool was spun by the fire, when clothes were mended, when children were fed and washed and told stories and put to bed, when the day's eggs were counted and the day's milk was processed, when the fire was fed its last fuel before banking. The light for all of this activity came from the fire itself and from whatever additional light source the family could afford. For the poorest families, the fire was the only light. Everything happened by the flickering amber glow of the hearth. For families with slightly more resources, a rushlight might be used. A rushlight was the poorest form of candle, made by soaking a dried rush, a type of wetland plant, in animal fat. It burned for maybe 15 to 20 minutes and gave off a weak, smoky, unsteady light that was barely adequate for close work. You could not weed by a rushlight. You could barely sew by one. But it was something. It was light. Beeswax candles existed, but were so expensive that most peasants never used them. Beeswax candles were for churches and for the wealthy. Tallow candles, made from rendered animal fat, were cheaper but still a luxury for many families. They smelled terrible when they burned, producing a thick, greasy smoke that coated everything in the room with a yellowish film. But they gave better light than rushlights, and for a family that could afford them, they extended the useful evening by an hour or more. And this is another thing that is easy to overlook about medieval life. The length of the useful day was determined entirely by light. In summer, when the days were long, people could work from 5 in the morning until 9 at night. 16 hours of available daylight. In winter, when the days were short, the window shrank to 8 or 9 hours, and those hours were often dim, cloudy, filtered through overcast skies that turned the landscape into shades of grey. The amount of work you could accomplish was directly tied to the amount of light available, and no amount of determination or effort could change that equation. This meant that winter was a fundamentally different experience from summer. Not just colder, not just darker, but slower, quieter, more interior. Winter was when people spent more time inside, huddled around the fire, doing indoor work, telling stories, sleeping longer because there was nothing else to do in the dark. Winter was when the stored food from the harvest was slowly consumed, and every week the supplies diminished a little more, and the quiet arithmetic of survival ran in the background of every conversation. Do we have enough grain to last until spring? Will the salted pork hold out? Should we slaughter the weakest chickens now, rather than feed them through the winter when they are not laying? But we are in the evening now, not yet winter, and the family is gathered around the fire. The pottage is warm. The ale is poured. The children are settling. And something is happening that has happened in this village every evening for as long as anyone can remember. Someone is talking, not just chatting. Talking. Telling a story. And medieval storytelling was an art form that we have almost completely lost. Without books, without literacy, without any way to record and preserve information except through the human voice and the human memory, storytelling was not entertainment. It was infrastructure. It was the mechanism by which everything important was preserved and transmitted from one generation to the next. Family histories, village legends, practical knowledge, moral lessons, weather lore, agricultural techniques, moral lessons, weather lore, agricultural techniques, medical remedies, legal precedents. All of it lived in stories. All of it was maintained by the act of speaking and listening night after night, year after year, generation after generation. The stories were not aimless. They were structured, repetitive, designed to be memorable, full of rhymes and rhythms and recurring phrases that made them easier to hold in the mind. This is why fairy tales have the structures they do. 3 brothers, 3 tasks, 3 wishes. The rule of 3 is not a literary invention. It is a memory device. It is a technology for storing information in a brain that has no other way to write things down. And the people who told these stories were valued. Not paid, usually, not formally recognized, but valued. The village elder who could recite the history of the manor and every family who had lived on it for 3 generations. The old woman who knew 300 herbal remedies and could describe the symptoms of every common illness and the preparation of every treatment. The grandfather who remembered the last great famine and could describe in vivid detail what happened and what the survivors did to make it through. These people were living libraries. When they died, their knowledge died with them unless they had successfully transferred it to someone younger who would carry it forward. This is why the death of an elder in a medieval village was not just a personal loss. It was a cultural catastrophe, a library burning, an archive destroyed, and everyone in the village knew it, which is why elders were respected even when their bodies were failing, even when they could no longer work in the fields, even when they needed care and feeding by a community that could barely afford to feed itself. The knowledge they carried was worth the investment. Their memories were communal property. And if you are still awake right now, and I suspect some of you are not, and that is perfectly fine, I want you to know that we are approaching the quietest part of the medieval day, the part where the fire dims and the voices soften and the world contracts to the size of a single room. The children are asleep, the animals are settled, the door is barred against the dark, and the adults are sitting in the firelight doing the last things they will do before sleep. She is spinning. He is mending a tool handle. They are not speaking much now. Just the creak of the spindle, the rasp of wood on wood, the pop of a log shifting in the fire. Outside, the village is quiet. You can hear a dog barking in the distance, the wind moving through thatch, an owl, the sounds that have accompanied human sleep for thousands of years, sounds that your brain still recognizes, still responds to, still finds comforting even if you have never slept in a medieval village. The woman stops spinning. She wraps the thread around the spindle, tucks it into a basket. She adds a last piece of wood to the fire, a small piece, just enough to keep the coals alive until morning. She checks the children, pulling a blanket higher on a small shoulder. She lies down on the straw mattress, pulling the wool blanket over herself, pressing close to the warm bodies already there. This is the moment. The threshold between waking and sleeping. The same threshold you are approaching right now. The medieval woman does not know what time it is. She does not care. She knows only that her body is tired, that the fire is warm, that her children are breathing beside her, that tomorrow will bring the same work and the same worries and the same small satisfactions. She closes her eyes. First sleep begins, and somewhere in the darkness between first sleep and second sleep, in that ancient gap that humans have been inhabiting for millennia, something happens that we will never be able to recover from the archaeological record. She thinks about what we cannot know, about tomorrow's work, about the child she lost 2 winters ago, about the way the light looked on the river this morning, about nothing at all. Just the dark and the warmth and the sound of breathing and the feeling of being alive in a world that asks everything of you and gives you just enough to keep going. And then second sleep takes her. Deep and complete. And the medieval day is finally over. Except it is not over, because the medieval day was never just one day. It was part of a vast repeating cycle, a wheel that turned with the seasons, carrying everyone in the village through the same arc again and again. And within that cycle there were variations, disruptions, events that broke the routine and reminded people that life was not only work and sleep and pottage. There were feast days, and feast days in the medieval calendar were far more numerous than you might expect. The medieval church calendar was dense with saints' days, holy days, and seasonal celebrations. Depending on the time and place, a medieval peasant might have had between 70 and 90 days per year when work was either prohibited or significantly reduced by religious observance. That is more vacation days than most modern American workers get. Not that they were vacations in the modern sense. They were religious obligations, days when you were expected to attend church, to pray, to participate in communal rituals, but the practical effect was the same. Days when the plow stayed in the barn and the fields were empty, and people had time to do things other than work. On these feast days, the village transformed. The church bells rang, not the ordinary bells that marked the canonical hours throughout the day, but the celebratory bells, the ones with the different rhythm, the ones that made children run to the village green. There might be food, better food than usual, meat on days when meat was normally forbidden, fresh bread, special dishes prepared only for this occasion. There might be ale, more than usual. and the alewife's house might be full to overflowing with people who had nowhere else to be and nothing they were required to do. They were games, wrestling matches, foot races, ball games that bore a vague resemblance to modern football or rugby but with no fixed rules, no set number of players, no clear boundaries, and a cheerful willingness to accept injuries that would send a modern athlete to the hospital. There was dancing, accompanied by drums and pipes and singing, the kind of dancing where the whole body moves and the whole community participates, and the boundaries between performer and audience dissolve entirely. There was drinking. There was fighting, because wherever there is drinking and young men with energy and old grievances, there will be fighting. There was flirting, because feast days were one of the few occasions when young people from different parts of the village, or even from neighbouring villages, could meet and interact without the constant supervision of work. And there was church. Always church. The feast day began and ended in the church, which was the centre of medieval village life in every possible sense. Geographically, because the church was usually the physical centre of the village; architecturally, because the church was the only stone building in a village of wooden and wattle and daub structures; socially, because the church was where everyone gathered, where announcements were made, where disputes were arbitrated, where marriages were blessed and the dead were buried; spiritually, because the church was where the terrifying and beautiful mystery of medieval Christianity was enacted every week. And I want to pause here and tell you something about medieval religion that might change the way you understand these people entirely. Medieval Christianity was not like modern Christianity. Not in practice, not in feeling, not in its relationship to daily life. For a modern person, religion is usually a compartment, something you do on Sundays or holidays, a set of beliefs you hold alongside and often separate from your daily routines. For a medieval peasant, religion was not a compartment. It was the air, it was the water, it was the explanation for everything. Why the harvest failed, why the baby died, why it rained on Tuesday, why the cow went lame, why your neighbour's house burned down. Everything that happened, good or bad, was understood through a religious lens. God's will, God's punishment, God's mercy, the saint's intercession, the devil's interference. This was not ignorance. This was not ignorance. This was a comprehensive worldview that provided answers to questions that had no other answers available. Why do children die? Because God calls them home. Why does the harvest fail? Because we have sinned and must repent. Why does the sun rise? Because God commands it. These answers were not satisfying by modern scientific standards, but they were emotionally and psychologically functional. They gave meaning to suffering. They provided a framework for understanding chaos. They offered hope in situations that were otherwise hopeless. And the rituals of the church were not cold formalities. They were intense, physical, communal experiences. The church itself was the most beautiful space most medieval peasants would ever enter. Stone walls, stained glass if the church could afford it, painted murals covering the walls with vivid scenes of heaven and hell, saints and demons, the life of Christ and the torments of the damned. These images were not decoration. They were education. In a world where most people could not read, the church walls were the textbook. The paintings told the stories that the priest told from the pulpit, reinforcing them visually, making them unforgettable. The smell of the church was distinctive and powerful. Incense, beeswax candles, old stone, damp wool from the congregation's clothing, the faint sweetness of the communion wine. These smells triggered a set of associations and emotions that were reinforced every single week from the time you were an infant. The church smelled like safety, like authority, like the presence of something vast and invisible and terrifyingly important. The sound of the church was equally powerful. The priest's voice, intoning Latin words that most of the congregation did not understand, but responded to with a physical reverence born of repetition. The singing, sometimes led by the priest, sometimes by the congregation, simple melodies repeated again and again until they became part of your body's memory. Songs you could sing in your sleep, songs that would come to your lips unbidden at moments of fear or grief. And here is something that I find profoundly moving about medieval village religion. For most medieval peasants, the church was the only place where they experienced beauty that was not functional. The fields were beautiful, perhaps, but the fields were work. The sunset was beautiful, but the sunset was a clock telling you to finish up. The church was the one space where beauty existed for its own sake, where colour and light and sound came together to create an experience that transcended the daily grind of survival. For 1 hour on a Sunday morning, the person who spent every other hour of the week covered in dirt and sweat and animal waste could stand in a stone building and look at painted angels and hear music that seemed to come from another world and feel, just for a moment, that there was more to existence than the next meal and the next chore and the next sunrise. I think that mattered. I think it mattered enormously. I think it is one of the reasons the medieval church wielded such extraordinary power over people's lives, not because people were stupid or gullible, but because the church provided something that nothing else in their world could provide: an experience of transcendence, a window into beauty, a weekly reminder that the universe was not just mud and toil and death, but also light and music and meaning. And now the day is truly ending. The feast day is over. The games are finished. The dancing has stopped. The alewife's house is emptying. People are walking home through the village in the long summer twilight or the early winter dark, depending on the season. The familiar sounds surround them: dogs settling, doors closing, the last murmur of conversation dying away, and the cycle begins again. Another night, another first sleep and second sleep, another rooster, another cold morning, another fire to restart, another pot of pottage to stir, another day in the fields. But before we leave this medieval village, before we return fully to the present and to the warm bed where you are lying right now, I want to tell you one more thing. Something that I think about often. Something that connects their world to yours in a way that no amount of historical detail can fully capture. These people, these ordinary medieval people whose names we will never know, they laughed. They laughed at their children's antics. They laughed at the pig that escaped and ran through the churchyard. They laughed at jokes that we would probably not understand, because humour is deeply specific to its time and place. But the laughter itself, the physical act of it, the way it starts in the belly and rises through the chest and bursts out of the mouth in a sound that is exactly the same, whether you are a medieval peasant or a modern office worker, that laughter connected them to every human who has ever lived and every human who ever will. They loved. Not in the way we see love depicted in movies, not with grand gestures and perfect words, but in the way that love actually works in real life. Quietly. Practically. A man who gets up first on a cold morning to restart the fire so his wife can sleep a few more minutes. A woman who saves the best piece of bread for her husband because she knows he is going back to the fields and he needs the energy more than she does. A mother who stays awake through child's fever, pressing cool cloths to a small forehead, praying to every saint she knows. A father who carves a tiny wooden horse for his daughter and hands it to her without ceremony because he saw her playing with a stick and pretending it was a horse, and he thought she deserved a better one. They grieved. They grieved with a rawness and an intensity that most modern people in comfortable societies rarely experience. They buried children. They buried partners. They buried parents. They buried friends. They buried friends. And they did it without the cushioning layers of modern grief, without therapy or support groups or antidepressants. They did it with prayer and community and the simple, brutal passage of time. And they endured. That is maybe the most important thing. They endured. Through famines and plagues and wars and winters that seemed like they would never end. Through back-breaking labour and chronic hunger and the constant low-grade fear that something would go wrong and there would be no safety net to catch them. They got up every morning and restarted the fire and fed the animals and walked to the fields and did it all again. Not because they were heroic, though they were. Not because they were stoic, though they were that too. But because that is what humans do. We endure. We get up. We keep going. We find small joys in difficult days. We build fires in the dark. You are doing the same thing. Whatever brought you to this video tonight, whatever weight you are carrying, whatever tomorrow holds, you are part of the same chain. The woman who restarted the fire is your ancestor. Maybe not biologically, but spiritually. She is the one who kept going so that you could be here. And the fact that you are here, lying in comfort, listening to a voice telling stories about people who lived 1,000 years ago, that would seem like a miracle to her, an absolute impossible, beautiful miracle. And now it is late. In the medieval village, the fires are banked and the doors are barred, and the only sounds are breathing and wind and the distant bark of a dog. In your room, whatever sounds surround you, they are the modern version of the same thing. The hum of a refrigerator, the whisper of a heating system, the distant murmur of traffic. Background sounds that your brain processes as safe, as normal, as home. If you enjoyed walking through this medieval day together, all I would ask is that you leave a small trace of your presence. A like is a thumbprint on the cave wall. A comment is a voice added to the circle around the fire. And a subscription is a promise to come back the next time we gather in the dark to talk about the past. None of it is required. All of it is appreciated. And if you do nothing at all except fall asleep, that is more than enough. That is exactly what this story was made for. Close your eyes now. The medieval day is over. The rooster will not crow for hours. The fire is warm. The straw is soft. The people you love are breathing beside you. And tomorrow, whatever it brings, you will get up and restart the fire. Because that is what we do. That is what we have always done. And that is enough. The fields are sleeping now under stars that have not changed in 1,000 years. The village is quiet. The ox is dreaming, whatever oxen dream, probably about grass. The chickens are roosted with their heads tucked under their wings. The pig is lying in its pen with its snout resting on its front hooves, eyes closed, completely content in a way that only pigs can be completely content. And you are here, safe, warm, alive, at the end of a very long day that began 1,000 years ago and ended right now, in this room, in this moment, with this breath. Sleep well. The fire will keep until morning. But maybe you are still here. Maybe sleep has not quite taken you yet. Maybe your mind is still turning, still curious, still reaching for one more detail, one more story, one more glimpse into that strange, familiar world that existed 1,000 years ago. And if that is the case, then I have so much more to tell you, because we have only scratched the surface of what a medieval day contained. We talked about the morning. We talked about the fire and the food and the animals and the fields. We talked about the evening and the stories and the ale and the slow dimming of the light. But there are entire worlds within that single day that we have not yet entered. And the first one is a world that medieval people inhabited every single day but rarely talked about directly. A world that shaped every decision they made, every prayer they whispered, every glance over their shoulder as they walked home after dark. A world that was, in many ways, more real to them than the physical landscape they walked through, the invisible world. Because here is something you need to understand about the medieval mind, and I do not mean this in a condescending way. I do not mean that medieval people were stupid or primitive or childlike. I mean that their experience of reality was fundamentally, structurally different from yours. And the difference was this. They lived in a world that was crowded with invisible beings. Angels, demons, saints, the souls of the dead, fairies, sprites, the wild hunt that rode across the sky on winter nights, the green man who lived in the forest, the spirits that inhabited wells and springs and crossroads and ancient burial mounds, the devil himself, who could appear in any form as a black dog, as a handsome stranger, as a beautiful woman, as a cold wind that blew out your candle and left you in darkness. These were not metaphors. They were not literary devices. They were not things that medieval people said they believed in while privately knowing better. They were as real as the ground under your feet, as real as the oak tree in the churchyard, as real as the bread in your hand, and their presence shaped every aspect of daily life in ways that are almost impossible for a modern secular person to fully appreciate. Let me give you a specific example. You are walking home from the fields at dusk. The path leads through a stretch of woodland, maybe a quarter-mile of dense trees between the open fields and the village. You have walked this path 1,000 times. You know every root and stone and turn. But tonight, something feels different. The light is fading faster than usual. The birds have gone quiet. There is a quality to the silence that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. A modern person might feel uneasy in this situation and attribute it to imagination, to being tired, to having watched too many horror movies. But a medieval person would attribute it to something specific. Something is here, something invisible but present, something that lives in the in-between places, the edges and margins and thresholds of the world. The space between field and village, the time between day and night, the border between the seen and the unseen. What do? You pray. You make the sign of the cross. You walk faster. You might mutter a specific prayer to a specific saint, because medieval Christianity was not a generalized spirituality. It was a system of specific relationships with specific supernatural beings. If you were afraid of the dark, you prayed to Saint Christopher. If you had lost something, you prayed to Saint Anthony. If your cow was sick, you prayed to Saint Blaise. If you were worried about your children, you prayed to the Virgin Mary. Each saint had a specialty, a jurisdiction, a particular kind of help they were known to provide. And your relationship with these saints was personal, intimate, transactional. You prayed to them, you made promises, you fulfilled those promises when your prayers were answered. You complained to them when they were not. This is not abstract theology. This is daily life. A medieval woman whose child has a fever does not think about her situation in terms of immune systems and viral loads. She thinks about it in terms of sin and grace, in terms of which saint to appeal to, in terms of whether she has done something to anger God, in terms of what offering she can make to secure divine intervention. And when the fever breaks, she does not think about antibodies. She thinks about mercy, about answered prayer, about the saint who interceded on her behalf. I am not telling you this to make you feel superior to medieval people. I am telling you this because understanding their invisible world is the key to understanding their daily experience. Without it, their behavior makes no sense. Why would a farmer stop work to walk to the church 3 times a week? Because the alternative was risking God's displeasure, which could manifest as a failed harvest or a dead child. Why would a woman refuse to do laundry on a particular saint's day? Because the last woman who did that, according to village memory, had her hands with her. Why would a man take a longer path home to avoid a particular crossroads after dark? Because everyone knew that crossroads were where the worlds intersected, where the dead sometimes lingered, where deals with the devil were struck. These beliefs were not separate from practical life. They were woven into it. The invisible world and the visible world were not 2 different things. They were 2 layers of the same thing. And navigating both layers simultaneously was part of the basic skill set of being a medieval person. But the invisible world was not only frightening, it was also comforting. Because if demons were real, then so were angels. If the devil could harm you, then God could protect you. If the dead could haunt you, then they could also watch over you. The medieval invisible world was dangerous, yes, but it was not empty. It was full of beings who cared about you, who were invested in your fate, who could be appealed to in times of trouble. For a person whose physical world was harsh and uncertain, whose children died and whose harvests failed and whose body ached from labor that never ended, the knowledge that invisible allies surrounded them was not a burden. It was a lifeline. And this brings us to something that happened in the medieval village that we have not discussed yet. Something that was woven into every single day, as regular as eating and sleeping, as constant as the turning of the sky. The church bells. You have probably heard church bells before, maybe in a movie, maybe from a distance. Maybe you live near a church and hear them on Sunday mornings. But you have almost certainly never experienced church bells the way a medieval person experienced them. Because for a medieval person, church bells were not background noise. They were the operating system of daily life. The bells rang at specific times throughout the day, marking the canonical hours, the schedule of prayer that structured the monastic day and, by extension, the entire Christian world. Matins in the early morning darkness, lauds at dawn, prime at the first hour, terce at the third hour, sext at the sixth hour, noon, none at the ninth hour, vespers at sunset, compline at bedtime. The bells did not ring for all of these hours in every parish church, but some version of this schedule was audible in every medieval village. The bells told you what time it was, not in hours and minutes, but in blocks of time that corresponded to the movement of the sun and the requirements of the church. The bells told you when to pray, when to eat, when to stop work, when to start. The bells announced births, deaths, marriages, emergencies. A specific pattern of ringing, fast and urgent, meant fire. Another pattern meant an approaching army. Another meant a death in the village. Everyone knew the codes. Everyone responded. The sound of the bells carried for miles across the flat medieval landscape. If you were in the fields, you could hear them. If you were in the fields, you could hear them. If you were in a forest, you could hear them. If you were on the road between villages, you could hear the bells of the village you were leaving fade behind you, and the bells of the village you were approaching grow louder ahead. The bells oriented you in space and time. They were the heartbeat of the community, a sound so constant and so familiar that you probably stopped consciously hearing them most of the time, the way you stop hearing the ticking of a clock in your own house, but you noticed when they stopped. If the bells did not ring, something was wrong. The priest was sick. The church was damaged. The village was under threat. The absence of bells was a silence so loud it was almost a sound itself, a gap in the fabric of normal life that made everyone uneasy. And this is what I want you to understand about medieval time. It was not like modern time. Modern time is precise, mechanical, numerical. You know exactly what time it is, down to the minute, down to the second. Your day is divided into discrete blocks, each one labelled and scheduled and accounted for. You are late, or you are early, or you are on time, and the difference between these states is measured in minutes. Medieval time was not like that. Medieval time was approximate, natural, communal. You did not know what time it was. Not exactly. You knew that it was morning or afternoon or evening. You knew that it was between terce and sext, or between vespers and compline. You knew by the position of the sun, by the length of the shadows, by the temperature of the air, by the behavior of the animals, by the sound of the bells, but you did not know that it was 3:47 in the afternoon, and the concept of 3:47 in the afternoon would have been meaningless to you. This imprecision was not a flaw. It was a feature. Medieval time was elastic. It stretched and compressed according to the needs of the moment. A pleasant conversation could go on for as long as it needed to without anyone checking their watch. A boring task could be endured without the torment of watching minutes crawl by on a clock face. You worked until the work was done, or until the light failed, or until the light failed, or until the bells told you to stop. You ate when you were hungry. You slept when you were tired. You lived in a time that was measured by bodies and seasons and bells, not by machines. There is a word for this kind of time that historians use. Task-oriented time that historians use. Instead of dividing the day into equal abstract units and then fitting tasks into those units, which is what we do, medieval people organized their time around tasks. You did not say, I will plow from 8 until 12. You said, I will plow the north field. And then you plowed the north field, and it took however long it took. And when it was done, you moved on to the next task. The task defined the time, not the other way around. Some historians argue that this shift from task-oriented time to clock-oriented time is one of the most profound changes in human history, more profound than the invention of the printing press or the steam engine, because it changed not just what we do but how we experience being alive. It changed our relationship with the present moment. It made us aware of time in a way that creates anxiety, that makes us feel perpetually behind schedule, that turns every minute into a resource to be optimized rather than a moment to be lived. Medieval people did not have that anxiety. They had other anxieties, plenty of them, but not the specific modern anxiety of running out of time. Their days were hard and their lives were short, but within those days, they experienced time differently than we do. They experienced it as a river, flowing at its own pace, carrying them along rather than something to be managed and measured and mastered. I think about that sometimes. I think about what it would feel like to live a single day without checking the time, without knowing what hour it is, without a schedule pressing down on every moment. I think about what it would feel like to simply work until the work is done, and rest until you are rested, and eat when you are hungry, and sleep when the light fails. Not as a vacation, not as a retreat, but as the normal way of being alive. And now I want to take you somewhere specific, somewhere that most history books mention only in passing, but that was for many medieval people one of the most important places in their entire world. A place that combined the practical and the spiritual, the social and the economic, in a way that nothing else in medieval life quite matched. The market. Not every village had a market. Markets required a royal charter, a formal permission from the king or the lord granting a specific place the right to hold a regular market on a specific day. But if your village was within walking distance of a market town, and most villages were, then market day was one of the most important days in your week. You prepared for market day the night before. You packed whatever you had to sell or trade, eggs from your chickens, a wheel of cheese from your cow's milk, a bundle of wool from your sheep, vegetables from your garden, maybe a piece of leatherwork or a basket you had woven. Whatever small surplus your household had produced beyond what you needed to survive, you wrapped these goods carefully, loaded them onto your back or onto a cart if you had one, or onto a donkey if you were fortunate enough to own one, and you set out before dawn. You set out before dawn. The walk to market might be 2 miles. It might be 5. It might be 10. You walked it in the dark, on roads that were not roads in the modern sense, but tracks worn into the landscape by centuries of feet and hooves. In dry weather, these tracks were dusty and rutted. In wet weather, they were rivers of mud that could suck a shoe off your foot or mire a cart to its axles. In winter, they might be frozen into treacherous ridges that could twist an ankle or break a wheel. There were no road maintenance crews, no drainage systems, no signage. You navigated by landmarks, by habit, by the position of the stars on clear mornings. But you were not alone on the road. Market day drew people from every village within walking distance. As you walked, you fell in with others heading the same way. Neighbours, acquaintances from the next village over, strangers from further afield. The road to market was a social space, a river of people and animals and goods, all flowing toward the same destination. Conversations happened naturally. News was exchanged. Gossip was shared. Relationships were formed. The road itself was a community. And then you arrived at the market town. And even for someone who made this journey every week, the market was something special. Because the market was the one place where the medieval world opened up, where you encountered people and goods and ideas from beyond your tiny village, where the vast world beyond the horizon briefly became visible and tangible. The market square was chaotic and colourful and loud. Stalls and tables were set up in rows, some covered with cloth awnings, others open to the sky. Sellers called out their wares. Buyers pushed through the crowd, examining goods, haggling over prices, testing fabric between their fingers, sniffing meat for freshness, squeezing fruit for ripeness. Children ran between the stalls, dodging adults, chasing dogs, stealing moments of unsupervised freedom that the normal village routine rarely allowed. The goods on display represented a web of production and trade that stretched far beyond anything a single village could produce. There was salt brought from mines or coastal salt pans sometimes hundreds of miles away. There was iron, smelted and forged into tools and nails and hinges by specialists whose skills were beyond anything a village blacksmith could match. There was cloth, not the rough homespun that peasants wore every day, but finer fabric woven in towns by professional weavers, dyed in colours that seemed impossibly vivid compared to the browns and greys of everyday clothing. There were spices brought from the other side of the world through a chain of traders so long that no single person in the chain knew where the spice had started or where it would end up. A pinch of pepper at a medieval English market had travelled from India or Southeast Asia, across the Indian Ocean, through the Middle East, across the Mediterranean, through the trading cities of Italy, over the Alps, through France, across the Channel, and into the hands of a merchant who sold it by the grain to people for whom it was one of the most exotic and expensive substances they would ever encounter. Think about that. A medieval peasant standing at a market stall in a muddy English town, holding a tiny amount of black pepper in their palm. Pepper that had crossed oceans and continents and passed through dozens of hands and travelled for months or years to reach this moment. They did not know its full journey. They could not imagine the tropical forests where it grew, or the ships that carried it, or the cities it passed through. But they knew it was special. They knew it was rare. They knew it came from very far away. And in that tiny handful of peppercorns, the entire medieval world, its trade networks, its ambitions, its connections across vast distances, was compressed into something you could taste. But the market was not only about goods, it was about information. Markets were where you heard news. Real news, not the village gossip that circulated endlessly through your band of 50 or 100 familiar faces, but news from the wider world. The king has raised taxes. There is a war in France. A plague has appeared in the next county. The Pope has issued a new decree. A famous outlaw has been captured. A miracle has occurred at a shrine 3 days' ride from here. This news travelled by mouth, from trader to trader, from traveller to traveller, accumulating distortions and embellishments at every step but carrying a kernel of truth that was often surprisingly accurate. Medieval people were not isolated from the wider world as we sometimes imagine. They were connected to it, but through human networks rather than technological ones. Through conversations at markets and fairs, through travelling friars and pilgrims and soldiers, through merchants who had been to places most people would never see. And the market was where justice happened. Not in every market town, but in many of them, market day coincided with the manorial court, the legal proceeding where disputes were settled, crimes were punished, and the rules of the community were enforced. These courts were not like modern courtrooms. They were more like community meetings with legal authority. The lord or his steward presided, but the jury was made up of local people, your neighbours, people who knew the parties involved, people whose judgment was shaped by years of shared experience. Cases ranged from the trivial to the serious. A dispute over a boundary between two plots of land, an accusation of theft, a charge of assault, a complaint that someone's pigs had damaged someone else's crops, a claim that a particular alewife was watering down her ale. Each case was heard, witnesses were called, arguments were made, and a judgment was rendered. Punishments could include fines, compensation to the injured party, public shaming, physical punishment such as time in the stocks, or in serious cases referral to higher courts. The stocks deserve a moment of attention because they reveal something important about medieval justice. The stocks were a wooden frame with holes for the ankles, sometimes also for the wrists and neck, in which an offender was locked and placed in a public space, usually the market square, for a specified period. While in the stocks, the offender was completely helpless. Passers-by could mock them, throw things at them, spit on them. It was humiliating, uncomfortable, and sometimes dangerous. But here is what the stocks really were. They were a display, a performance, a public demonstration that the community had rules and that breaking those rules had consequences. The point was not primarily to cause physical suffering, though it certainly did that. The point was to be seen, to be witnessed by every person who walked through the market square, to have your shame observed and recorded in the collective memory of the community, in a world where reputation was everything, where your good name determined whether people would help you in times of need or turn their backs. Public humiliation was a devastating punishment, worse in many ways than a fine or a beating, because a beating healed but a ruined reputation could follow you for the rest of your life. And this brings us back to something I mentioned earlier, the extraordinary power of community in medieval life, the power to include and exclude, to embrace and reject, to support and abandon. In a world without police, without formal welfare systems, without insurance or savings accounts, your community was your safety net, and the threat of losing your place in that community was the most powerful disciplinary tool available. If you stole from your neighbor, you might be fined. But you would also be talked about, remembered, watched more carefully from now on. And the next time you needed help, a loan of grain during a lean month, an extra pair of hands during harvest, someone to look after your children when you were sick, that help might be slower in coming, might come with conditions attached, might not come at all. This is not cruelty, it is survival logic. In a community where resources are scarce and cooperation is essential, a person who cheats the system is a genuine threat to everyone else. And the mechanisms for dealing with that threat, gossip, reputation, shame, exclusion, are not primitive alternatives to a proper justice system. They are, in many ways, more nuanced and more effective than formal legal systems because they are embedded in the same social fabric that makes daily life possible. But let us leave the market now. The sun is past its peak. Your basket is lighter because you have sold your eggs and your cheese. Your purse is heavier, or rather your small leather pouch contains a few more coins than it did this morning. You have bought salt, which you needed desperately. You have bought a new clay pot to replace the one that cracked last week. You have treated yourself to a small luxury, maybe a ribbon for your daughter's hair, or a handful of dried fruit that you will ration over the coming days. And you have news. You have heard about a wedding in the next village. You have heard about a dispute between two landowners that might affect the use of common pasture. You have heard a rumor, probably exaggerated, about an army moving through a region 2 days' ride to the south. You have heard that the price of wool is rising, which is good news if you have sheep. You have seen someone you had not seen in months and spent a few minutes catching up, learning that their eldest daughter has married and their youngest son has been sent to apprentice with a carpenter in town. You carry all of this home with you. All of this information, all of these social connections, all of these small transactions that together make up the economic and social life of the medieval world. You carry it on your back along with your new salt and your clay pot, walking the same muddy track you walked this morning, but in the opposite direction, heading back toward the village, toward the fire, toward the evening routine that awaits. And here I want to take you somewhere that we have not gone yet, somewhere that most people overlook entirely when they think about medieval life, but somewhere that was, for many medieval people, one of the most important and most complicated spaces in their daily experience. The body. Because medieval people had bodies, obviously, but their relationship with their bodies was profoundly different from ours. And understanding that relationship unlocks something essential about what it felt like to be alive 1,000 years ago. Start with pain. We live in a world where pain is, for most of us most of the time, manageable. We have aspirin and ibuprofen and acetaminophen. We have anesthesia for surgery. We have prescription painkillers for chronic conditions. We have heating pads and ice packs and physical therapy. Pain is something we acknowledge, treat, and usually minimize. Medieval people had none of this. If you had a toothache, you had a toothache. There was no dentist. There was no Novocaine. There was no gentle extraction with sterile instruments. If the tooth was bad enough, you went to the barber or the blacksmith, because those were the people who had the tools to pull teeth, and they yanked it out with a pair of pliers while someone held you down. Without anesthesia, without antiseptic, without antibiotics for the infection that frequently followed. If you broke your arm, someone set it as best they could, splintered it with sticks and cloth, and you waited. If the bone healed straight, you were lucky. If it healed crooked, you lived with a crooked arm for the rest of your life. If it became infected, you might lose the arm. You might lose your life. A broken bone, an event that modern medicine handles routinely and almost always successfully, was a life-altering and potentially life-ending event in the medieval world. Headaches, backaches, joint pain, muscle strains, menstrual cramps, the chronic discomfort of a body that worked too hard and slept on a straw mattress and never quite got enough to eat. These were constant companions. There was no escape from them. There was no escape from them. There was no pill to take. There were herbal remedies, certainly, and some of them worked. Willow bark contains salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin, and was widely used for pain relief. Poppy extracts were known and sometimes available for severe pain. Certain herb teas could settle stomachs or ease headaches, but these remedies were inconsistent in their potency, limited in their availability, and frequently inadequate for serious pain. The result was that medieval people lived with a baseline level of physical discomfort that most modern people would find intolerable. Not screaming agony, not constant crisis, just a steady, low-level presence of pain and discomfort that coloured every moment of every day. Your back hurt from ploughing. Your hands were cracked and calloused from constant manual labour. Your feet ached from walking miles on uneven ground in shoes that were basically flat pieces of leather tied around your foot. Your eyes strained in the dim light. Your lungs hurt from the constant smoke of the indoor fire. Your teeth, the ones you still had, were worn down and sensitive and occasionally abscessed in ways that made eating a torment. And here is something that I find both horrifying and strangely inspiring about medieval attitudes toward pain. They did not see it the way we do. We see pain as a problem to be solved, an error in the system, something that should not be happening and can be fixed with the right intervention. Medieval people saw pain differently. They saw it as meaningful, as purposeful, as a message from God. The medieval church taught that suffering was redemptive, that Christ had suffered on the cross for the sins of humanity, and that human suffering, willingly accepted, could participate in that cosmic sacrifice. That pain brought you closer to God, that enduring hardship with patience and faith was a form of worship, a way of demonstrating your devotion, a way of earning merit in the eyes of a deity who had himself chosen to suffer. This theology of suffering had profound effects on how people experienced pain. It did not make the pain less painful, but it made it less meaningless. A modern person with a chronic backache might feel frustrated, angry, victimized by a body that is not working properly. A medieval person with the same backache might feel all of those things too, but they would also have a framework for understanding their suffering that gave it purpose. My back hurts because I am doing the work God assigned to me. My suffering is not random. It is part of a larger story. It means something. I am not suggesting that this is a better way of experiencing pain. I am not romanticizing medieval suffering. I am simply observing that the meaning we attach to pain changes the experience of pain, and that medieval people attached very different meanings to it than we do. And in doing so, they may have been, in some ways, better equipped to endure the chronic discomfort that defined their physical lives. But the medieval body was not only about pain. It was also about pleasure. And medieval pleasures, though simpler and less frequent than ours, were no less intense. Food, when it was good, was deeply satisfying. The taste of fresh bread still warm from the oven after weeks of eating stale leftovers. The richness of a piece of roasted meat on a feast day after months of nothing but pottage. The sweetness of honey, one of the few sweeteners available, spooned over porridge or dissolved in warm ale. The tartness of the first berries of summer, eaten straight from the bush, juice running down your chin. These were not everyday experiences. That is precisely what made them so powerful. In a world where good food was rare, every good meal was an event. Every flavor was vivid. Every bite was meaningful. Physical rest after a day of hard labor was a pleasure so profound that it bordered on the spiritual, the moment when you finally stopped moving. When you lowered yourself onto the straw mattress and let your muscles unclench and felt the warmth of the fire on your face and the weight of the blanket on your body, that moment was not just rest, it was bliss. The kind of bliss that can only come from genuine exhaustion, from having pushed your body to its limits and finally being allowed to stop. Warmth. On a cold winter night, the warmth of the fire and the warmth of the bodies beside you was a pleasure that went beyond comfort. It was survival experienced as sensation, the heat seeping into your bones, thawing the numbness in your fingers and toes, relaxing muscles that had been clenched against the cold for hours. Warmth was not something you took for granted. It was something you earned, maintained, and savoured. And there were other pleasures too. The pleasure of a hot bath, which happened rarely but was highly valued. Medieval people were not as filthy as we sometimes imagine. They washed when they could. Public bathhouses existed in many towns and were popular gathering places. When a bathhouse was not available, people washed in rivers and streams in warm weather or heated water over the fire in cold weather. They did not wash every day, certainly not by modern standards, but the pleasure of being clean after days or weeks of accumulated grime was intense and deeply satisfying. The pleasure of music, a song around the fire, a pipe played by a wandering musician, the communal singing that happened at church and at festivals. Music was not a commodity in the medieval world. It was not something you consumed passively through earbuds. It was something you participated in, something your body did. Singing was not a spectator sport. Everyone sang. Everyone knew the songs. And the pleasure of singing together, of feeling your voice blend with other voices, of being carried along by a melody that everyone knew, that pleasure was available to everyone regardless of wealth or status. The pleasure of companionship, of sitting with someone you loved and saying nothing, of watching your child learn to walk, of hearing your mother's voice telling a story you had heard 100 times before, of knowing that the people around you knew you completely, knew your strengths and your weaknesses, your kindnesses and your petty cruelties, and chose to stay anyway. These pleasures were not sophisticated. They were not curated or optimized or enhanced by technology. They were simple, physical, communal, and immediate. And I sometimes wonder whether their simplicity made them more satisfying, not less. Whether the medieval experience of pleasure was actually more vivid than ours, precisely because it was rarer, less mediated, less taken for granted. But the body in the medieval world was not only a site of pain and pleasure, it was also a mystery, because medieval people did not understand their bodies the way we understand ours. They did not know about germs or viruses or bacteria. They did not know about blood circulation or oxygen or neurons. They did not know why they got sick or why they got better or why some people lived to be 70 and others died at 7. What they had instead was a system of understanding called humoral medicine, inherited from the ancient Greeks through the Romans and the Arabs, and refined over centuries of observation and speculation. The basic idea was that the body contained 4 humors, 4 fundamental fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and that health depended on keeping these 4 humors in balance. Too much blood made you sanguine, hot and energetic, and prone to fevers. Too much phlegm made you phlegmatic, cold and sluggish, and prone to respiratory illness. Too much yellow bile made you choleric, angry and aggressive, and prone to digestive problems. Too much black bile made you melancholic, sad and withdrawn, and prone to depression. This system was not random. It was based on centuries of observation, and it got some things right. It correctly associated certain personality types with certain physical tendencies. It correctly identified diet and lifestyle as factors in health. It correctly understood that balance and moderation were important for well-being. Where it went wrong, spectacularly and sometimes fatally wrong, was in its prescriptions for restoring balance. Bloodletting. If you had too much blood, the obvious solution was to remove some. This was done by cutting a vein, usually in the arm, and letting blood flow into a bowl until the physician or barber decided you had lost enough. The practice was widespread, routine, and almost certainly harmful. Removing blood from a sick person weakens them further, increases their risk of infection, and can, in severe cases, cause death from blood loss. But the logic was internally consistent. If the problem is too much blood, then removing blood is the solution. The theory was elegant. The practice was deadly. Purging. If the problem was an imbalance of bile, the solution was to flush the system. This was done through emetics, substances that induced vomiting, or purgatives, substances that induced violent diarrhea. Both of these were brutal on the body, and frequently made the patient worse rather than better. But again, the logic was consistent within the system. If the body is out of balance, force it to expel the excess. And here is where the medieval relationship with the body becomes really interesting and really poignant. Because for all the failures of humoral medicine, medieval people were not passive victims of their medical system. They were active participants in their own healthcare, using a combination of herbal remedies, dietary adjustments, prayer, and practical common sense that was often more effective than the formal medical theories would suggest. The village healer, often a woman, often elderly, often operating outside the formal medical establishment, was a repository of practical knowledge accumulated over generations. She knew which herbs reduced fever and which ones made it worse. She knew how to set a simple fracture and how to clean and bind a wound. She knew which teas settled a stomach and which ones eased the pain of childbirth. She knew the signs of dangerous infection and the signs of a patient was likely to recover on their own. Much of this knowledge was genuinely effective, not because it was based on correct theory, but because it was based on centuries of trial and error. If a particular herb consistently reduced fever, people noticed and remembered, even if they attributed its effectiveness to the wrong mechanism. Childbirth was perhaps the area where this practical knowledge was most vital and most impressive. Medieval midwives, working without any of the technologies that modern obstetrics takes for granted, no ultrasounds, no fetal monitors, no epidurals, no cesarean sections, managed to deliver most babies safely. Not all. The maternal mortality rate was horrifying by modern standards. Perhaps 1 in 30 births resulted in the mother's death, compared to about 1 in 5,000 in modern developed countries. But the fact that 29 out of 30 births were successful, in the absence of any modern technology, is a testament to the skill and knowledge of the women who attended them. These midwives knew how to turn a breech baby by external manipulation. They knew how to manage hemorrhage with pressure and herbs. They knew how to support a labouring woman through the long hours of a difficult delivery with calm words and physical comfort. They knew when a birth was proceeding normally and when something was going wrong. And they passed this knowledge from mother to daughter, from midwife to apprentice, in an unbroken chain that stretched back centuries. The medieval body was also a social body, by which I mean that your physical condition was not a private matter. Everyone in the village knew if you were sick. Everyone knew if you were pregnant. Everyone knew if you were injured. Privacy in the modern sense. The idea that your health is your own business and nobody else's did not exist in a community where everyone lived in close proximity and where one person's illness could mean another person had to take on their share of the communal workload. This meant that sickness was a community event. When someone fell ill, neighbors came by. They brought food. They helped with chores. They sat with the sick person. They offered advice, some helpful, some not. They prayed. They gossiped about the illness, speculating about its causes and predicting its outcome. Illness was public, visible, communal. You were never sick alone. And death, when it came, was equally communal. The dying person was surrounded by family and neighbors. Prayers were said continuously. The priest was called to administer last rites, the final sacraments that prepared the soul for its journey. The moment of death was witnessed by multiple people, and the preparation of the body for burial was a communal task performed by the women of the village, with a tenderness and a practicality that came from long experience. The body was washed. It was dressed in clean clothes, the best available. It was laid out usually in the home for a period of watching that could last 1 or 2 days. During this time, people came to pay their respects, to sit with the family, to share memories of the dead. Food was brought. Ale was provided. The watching was both a vigil and the wake, a time of sorrow and a time of coming together. Then the burial. The body was carried to the churchyard, sometimes on a board, sometimes in a simple wooden coffin, sometimes wrapped in cloth. The priest said the words. The body was lowered into the ground. Earth was thrown over it. A wooden marker might be placed, though wood rots quickly and most medieval graves are unmarked today. The living went home. The pot of pottage was still on the fire. The animals still needed feeding. The fields still needed tending. Life continued because it had to. And that evening, around the fire, someone told a story about the person who had died, and in that story the dead person was alive again for a few minutes, walking through the village, laughing at a joke, shouting across a field, being completely, vividly, undeniably human. That is how medieval people preserved their dead, not in stone monuments or written records, though the wealthy had those, in stories, in the memory of the community, in the words spoken around a fire on a dark night by people who loved them and missed them and would carry them forward, 1 generation at a time, until the stories themselves faded and only the living remained. And now it is very late. In the medieval village, even the dogs have gone quiet. The fire has burned down to its deepest glow, that point where the coals are more white than orange, still radiating heat, but no longer producing light. The darkness has reclaimed the room. The children are deep in second sleep, their breathing slow and steady and rhythmic, a sound that any parent in any era would recognize as the sound of safety. The woman lies on the straw mattress. Her body hurts. It always hurts. Her lower back from bending in the garden. Her hands, cracked and rough. Her feet, swollen from a day of walking and standing. But the pain is familiar now. It is part of her the way the sound of her own breathing is part of her. She does not fight it. She accepts it. Not because she is brave, though she is, but because there is no alternative, and she knows it, and acceptance is easier than resistance when resistance is pointless. She thinks about tomorrow. The grain needs to be taken to the mill. The garden needs weeding. The youngest child has a cough that worries her. She will make a tea from dried elderflower and honey if there is honey left. She will ask the old woman down the lane for advice. She will pray to Saint Blaise, patron of throats and coughs, and hope that the prayer is heard. She thinks about her mother, who died 3 years ago. She thinks about her like this sometimes, in the dark, when the world is quiet enough to allow it. She misses her mother's hands. The way they moved when she was kneading bread. The way they felt on her forehead when she was sick as a child. Cool and dry and steady. Hands that knew what to do. Hands that had done everything. She thinks about nothing for a while. Just the dark and the warmth and the breathing. Her mind loosens its grip on the day. Images float by without urgency. The market, the field, the sunset, the face of her youngest child looking up at her with total trust, the smell of bread baking, the sound of bells, and then sleep takes her, gently, completely, the way sleep has taken every human being who has ever lived, the way it is taking you right now, if you will let it. The medieval day is ending for the second time tonight. The fire is keeping. The animals are quiet. The village is a collection of small warm lights that have gone dark one by one, each household surrendering to the night at its own pace, each family entering the ancient compact of sleep. You are vulnerable now. You are unconscious. But you are not alone. You are surrounded by the people who know you best, by the community that will wake with you tomorrow, by the cycle that has repeated itself so many times that it feels less like a routine and more like a law of nature. Wake, work, eat, rest, sleep, wake again. And somewhere in the darkness between this sleep and the next waking, in that liminal space where the medieval mind and the modern mind are indistinguishable, something waits. Something that has always waited. Something that your ancestors knew by 100 different names, but that you might simply call tomorrow. It will come. It always comes. And when it does, you will rise and restart the fire and feed the animals and walk to the fields and do it all over again. Not because you have to, though you do, but because this is what it means to be alive. This is what it has always meant. The endless, exhausting, beautiful repetition of days that are never quite the same, even when they seem identical. The accumulation of small moments that, when strung together across a lifetime, form something that can only be called a life, your life, their same life, separated by centuries, but connected by the simple, stubborn, magnificent act of getting up every morning and choosing to continue. The bells will ring again at dawn, but for now, there is only the dark and the warmth and the slow breathing of the world asleep, and still the night holds you. Both of you. The medieval sleeper on her straw mattress and you on yours, wherever yours happens to be. Both of you suspended in that ancient agreement between the body and the dark. The agreement that says, I will stop now, I will let go now, I will trust the night to carry me, and trust the morning to bring me back. But there is one more thing I want to tell you before the story ends completely. One more corner of the medieval day that we have not explored. And it is perhaps the most human corner of all, the one that has nothing to do with survival or economy or religion or labour, the one that has to do with something so simple and so universal that it barely needs a name. Children playing. We have talked about children working, children fetching water, children watching pigs, children learning to harvest and spin and identify plants. All of that is true. Medieval children worked hard and they started young, but they also played, and their play was not a footnote to their lives. It was the beating heart of their childhood, the thing that made them human before the world made them labourers. Medieval children played in the dirt. They built tiny houses from sticks and mud. They made dolls from rags and carved animals from scraps of wood. They played chase and tag and hiding games in the lanes between houses and in the edges of the fields. They threw stones at targets. They wrestled. They climbed everything that could be climbed: trees, walls, fences, haystacks, sometimes falling and hurting themselves, because children have always fallen and hurt themselves, and that is part of how they learn where the edges of the world are. They played in the water when the weather was warm, splashing in the stream that ran near the village, learning to swim by the simple method of being thrown in by older children and figuring it out. They caught frogs and studied them with the intense fascination that children bring to every small creature. They collected things: interesting stones, feathers, shells if they lived near the coast, bits of broken pottery, small treasures that had no value to anyone except the child who found them and who carried them around in a pocket or a pouch like talismans against the bigness of the world. They played pretend. They pretended to be knights and ladies. They pretended to be animals. They pretended to be their own parents, mimicking the gestures and voices of the adults around them with an accuracy that was sometimes hilarious and sometimes unhilarious and sometimes unsettling. A 4-year-old girl stirring a pot of mud and lecturing an invisible child about not wasting food. A 6-year-old boy marching around the yard with a stick for a sword, shouting orders at an army of chickens. These are not modern inventions. These are ancient human behaviours. Every child who has ever lived has played pretend, transforming the world around them into a stage for stories that only they can see. And here is what gets me about medieval childhood. What makes me stop and think and feel something that is hard to put into words. These children played with complete absorption, complete presence. They were not dividing their attention between a game and a screen. They were not half playing and half watching something else. When a medieval child built a house from sticks, that house was real. When they chased a friend through the village, the chase was everything. When they sat in the dirt and made a world from mud and imagination, they were fully, entirely, completely there. I think about that sometimes, about what it means to be fully present in a game, fully present in a moment, fully absorbed in something that has no purpose except the pleasure of doing it. I think about how rare that is now, how we have surrounded ourselves with so many demands on our attention that the simple act of being completely engaged in one thing feels almost impossible. And I think about those medieval children playing in the dirt, unaware that they were living in a time that future people would call the Dark Ages, unaware that their world would be studied and analysed and debated for centuries, unaware of everything except the warmth of the sun on their backs and the feel of the mud between their fingers and the sound of their friend laughing on the other side of the hedge. They did not know they were living in history. They just knew they were alive. And that, I think, is the most important thing that the medieval day can teach us. Not the details of farming or cooking or tool-making, not the intricacies of feudal economics or church hierarchy, but the simple, profound, easily forgotten truth that every day, no matter how ordinary, no matter how ordinary, no matter how ordinary, you have hurt, no matter how hard, is a day of being alive. And being alive is not a background condition. It is the main event. The medieval peasant who woke up in the dark and restarted the fire and fed the animals and walked to the fields and ploughed and harvested and came home exhausted and ate pottage and told stories and fell asleep on a straw mattress, that person was not living a lesser life than yours. A different life, yes. A harder life in many ways, certainly. But not a lesser one. Because the things that make a life meaningful, Love, work, community, beauty, struggle, rest, the laughter of children, the comfort of a fire in the dark. Those things have not changed. They cannot change. They are wired into us at a level that no amount of technology or progress can reach. And maybe that is why these stories about ordinary days and distant times feel so compelling. Not because the past is exotic or romantic or better than the present. It is none of those things. But because seeing how other people lived, how they managed the same fundamental challenges that we face, how they found meaning and pleasure and connection in circumstances that would overwhelm most modern people, that seeing does something to us. It calibrates us. It reminds us what is essential and what is not. It strips away the noise of modern life and reveals the signal underneath. The signal is simple. You are alive. You woke up today. You will eat something. You will interact with people who matter to you. You will do work of some kind. Useful work, necessary work. You will rest. You will sleep. And tomorrow, you will do it again. And in the doing of it, in the sheer stubborn repetition of it, you are participating in something that stretches back through every generation that has ever lived. An unbroken chain of ordinary days, each one unremarkable on its own, each one essential to the continuation of the human story. The medieval woman on her straw mattress is part of that chain. You are part of that chain. The child who will be born tomorrow is part of that chain. And the chain does not break. It bends and stretches and loops back on itself in ways that are impossible to predict. But it does not break, because every morning, somewhere in the world, someone wakes up and restarts the fire. Every morning, someone feeds the children. Every morning, someone walks out into the fields, whatever the fields look like now, and begins the work of keeping everything going for one more day. That is the story. The whole story. Not the kings and the battles and the great events that fill the history books. The story is the ordinary day, the unremarkable Tuesday, the pottage bubbling on the fire, the child laughing in the dirt, the woman spinning wool by the light of a rushlight that will burn out in 15 minutes, the man mending a fence that will need mending again next month, the dog sleeping by the hearth, the rooster that will scream tomorrow at dawn, whether anyone wants it to or not. That is the story, and it is your story too. Even now, even here, even in this moment, as your eyes grow heavy and your breathing slows and the words begin to blur and the meaning begins to dissolve into something softer and warmer and less precise. You are the latest chapter in a very old book, a book that has no author and no ending, a book that is being written right now, in this breath, in this heartbeat, in this slow, sweet slide towards sleep. The medieval village is quiet. The fire has gone to embers. The stars are wheeling overhead in the same patterns they have followed for millennia. The owl is hunting. The fox is moving through the undergrowth. The stream is running over the same stones it has polished for 10,000 years. And inside every small house in the village, people are sleeping, dreaming, healing, growing, preparing without knowing it for another day that will be both exactly the same as today and completely, irreversibly different. And you are sleeping too, or almost sleeping, or pretending to sleep while your mind does that last gentle loop before it lets go entirely. Whatever state you are in right now, it is the right state. There is nowhere else you need to be. Nothing else you need to do. The work is done. The fire is banked. The children are safe. Tomorrow will take care of itself. If this story carried you somewhere peaceful tonight, I am glad. And if you want more nights like this, more slow journeys through the ordinary corners of history, more quiet hours spent in the company of people who lived centuries ago but felt exactly the same things you feel, then you might want to look at what else is on this channel. There is a video about how humans conquered the darkness, the entire history of light, from the first campfire to the electric bulb, told at the same slow pace, designed for the same purpose, to carry you gently from wakefulness into rest. There are other stories too, other ordinary days in extraordinary times. other windows into lives that were different from yours in every detail and identical to yours in every way that matters. They will be there whenever you need them. Whenever the night feels too long, or the mind feels too busy, or the world feels too loud, they will be waiting, like a fire that never quite goes out. But that is for another night. Tonight is complete. The story has been told. The medieval day has run its course from darkness to darkness, from first sleep to second sleep, from the rooster's scream to the owl's silence. And you were there for all of it, walking the muddy roads, tasting the pottage, hearing the bells, watching the children play, feeling the straw under your back and the wool over your shoulders and the warmth of the fire on your face. You were there, and now you are here. And in between there and here, nothing essential has changed. The human heart still beats the same rhythm. The human hand still reaches for the same warmth. The human waint still tells the same stories in the dark. Sleep now. Sleep the way they slept. Deeply. Completely. Without apology. The rooster will not crow for hours. The fire will keep. And tomorrow, as it always has, as it always will, the sun will rise over the fields, and someone will get up, and the whole beautiful, ordinary, impossible thing will begin again. Good night.